When I first got into this simple living things, we used to say, you know, I try to live simply so that others simply may live. And it's going to take somebody letting go of something. And in our case, we think, oh, we're not going to try to get rich, we're going to try to spread whatever money that we can bring into it amongst more and more people. Sometimes when you learn something good, that sharing it with other people, at least in our case, has not meant that we do less well. We do well and they do better as well. My name is Ira Wallace, and I'm a member of ACORN Community Farm, the home of Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. We're an intentional community where we're trying to live a life that is a bit lighter on the land, and where we practice as best we can economic justice and preserve heirloom varieties, and also work with breeders who are trying to make more open pollinated varieties that are available to the people for the future. Maybe they're the heirlooms of the future. In addition to living and working here on Southern Exposure, I write about gardening and seeds and seed politics. We work especially with what we call family heirlooms. And these are varieties that are maintained by a certain family or sometimes a certain community. Like we have a Suchus bean that lots of people in Suchus, Georgia, maintain, and it's a little yellow bean. But you don't eat it when it's thin and crisp like regular green beans. It's a yellow bean, and you wait until the seeds have formed inside, and just before the pods go from crisp to flaccid, as you get all that good protein, plus you have a nice crisp vegetable around it, and that's kind of fun. Gramenelli's mushroom bean is kind of like that, and they have, some people say that type of bean has a bit of a mushroom flavor and texture to add to it. And these things are really good when people were actually growing their gardens to sustain themselves. You want to have as much of a complete diet out of your garden as you can. We try to have food plants, that are native, and food plants that come more from the American diaspora. Sometimes when you talk about heirlooms, people kind of think of heirlooms in Europe together. But the rest of the world was there too. And there are people from all parts of the world. They keep telling me that we're almost at a point where there are more brown and black people in the U.S. than white. So one of our little things that we do is to try to bring more of those vegetables from that varied, immigrant populations into our catalog. And it's kind of slow because you got to grow something, and if you don't know how to grow it, you got to learn how to grow it so you can tell people. Because a lot of times with something from another country, it's timing, and you think this will not grow. For example, I love Thai red roselle, and I grew up in Florida where they grew a type that came from Jamaica, and I could not get it to go to seed here to save my life. But you find out it's dayland sensitive, and so you have to get a cultivar. They have one in Jamaica that's an early one, and so you can get seeds here in Virginia. But many varieties you have to be much further south because they will not form seeds, until October, for example, and there's not enough time for it. But when you learn those things, and then you can say, well, maybe this is one that you'll grow in a pot and have it inside to finish ripening the seeds. In the same way that people from countries where figs or fresh figs or something, they keep a big old pot of a little fig bush. And So this is sort of, I call it my final project for Southern Exposure, is bringing in more things, especially from the African diaspora. But as I say, the thing that happened when I started reaching out to more people who were recent immigrants of color is I meet people who are not just of African descent, people from India, people from the Pacific Islands, all of these places. And I can't believe, I was supposed to be all progressive and black, and I just wasn't even thinking about, how white our seed varieties are. And people like stuff because you look at those restaurants. They're all over, restaurants from other countries, but it's like when it's time for your garden, you think, no, if it didn't grow in Denmark in 1852, it's not worth growing. Not true. I grew up with my grandmother, and she gardened, and we saved a little bit of seed, and this is that thing of saving one or two seeds at home. Honestly, she died the year I went to college. So I don't know. In those days, I didn't think of this as anything other than a thing you do if you garden. Not like great big old deal or politics or nothing. And when, and I took a field taxonomy class because you got to walk around and get credit. I mean, honestly, that's why I took it. But then I learned a little bit, just about wild plants and wild herbs and stuff like that, and that they're a little more trouble to save the seeds from. But it, became aware of it. We had a student garden, and we saved little seeds there just for the fun of it. But then I went to North Carolina at my first community adventure. 6 of us and our kids bought a farm in Cedar Grove, North Carolina, not that far from Chapel Hill. And that was just at the time the North Carolina Botanical Gardens was starting to do plant rescues and doing their habitat gardens. And so I just learned about, the idea of conservation through growing plants. And it was purely accidental. I went there to volunteer in the herb garden, but this whole thing was going around. There were all these people who were all excited about it, and I was like, oh, that's so cool. I want to be cool. And that kind of got me into, wild and native herbs and stuff like that. And doing these, every time I got with these wild plants, it made me think vegetables and flowers are so easy compared. So I'd save a few more, and meeting people through those who both who were just gardeners and farmers trying to do this stuff because they thought it was the right thing, and people, like the staff at the garden who had more formal training. And I really think that that's a sweet spot. When something that people who have a PhD agree with people who actually grow food, you're really talking something that might be powerful. Working with heirloom varieties, what you find out is that varieties that become well known and that are saved and cherished by a lot of people are ones that have a story that evokes a time and a place that might not be there anymore, or that you might have to go far back in the countryside to find. And so, like Radiator Charlie's Mortgage Lifter, there are a lot of German red-pink tomatoes, but it's famous because you can imagine you're sitting here in this radiator shop down at the bottom of the hill in West Virginia, and people are going up in cars in the 40s, and they overheat, and they come in, and you got tomato plants, and those plants you have for $1 each, and people will take one, grow it at home, and then just talk about how good it is, how big and juicy and sweet with just a bit of tartness. And so you start having people who go out of their way on a little weekend trip, a couple 100 miles, just so they can get one of those tomato plants. I like also some of the scientific facts that you learn in a backhanded way with stories. Miss Tappy, who gave us our first German red pink type tomato, which was TAPPY'S, and she said, now let me tell you, you can't grow any other tomatoes around TAPPY'S because she's a promiscuous tomato. And it turned out that Miss Tappy knew something that most scientists at that point did not know, which is that heirloom, especially large multi-lobed heirloom tomatoes, have extruded style. And so they're like out hanging out at the edge of the flower saying, come and get it, to all the nearby ones. And the flowers are a little bit bigger than other tomatoes, and so they attract pollinators more. So you have a much higher rate of outcrossing. And at the time when Jeff was doing this, first doing this in the 80s, he was taught, he has a PhD in pollination ecology, and they said 10 feet is going to be sufficient to not have crossing. He kept having this crossing. He was like, what the heck is going on here? And noticed that characteristic and wrote about it. And now that's the accepted wisdom, that you have a bigger isolation distance with these large heirloom tomatoes. And also with some of the very small cherry tomatoes that are closer to the type. So you learn these things, and it's not just people with PhDs who make observations and scientific discoveries. Here's one that I like because it was one that I sort of fell into. I found it at the farm of Mark Schoenbeck, who does a lot of writing for the Virginia Association for Biological Farming about politics and food and stuff. But he was talking about how all his beans were dead as a doornail. But we go out there and there's like this beautiful haze of purple and green, and it was this Dean's bean, because all of the other beans had been chowed down by the bugs. But for some reason, these purple beans, and this often is true, weren't as attractive. And so he gave me some and introduced me to Dean Turley, who had been a school teacher, and one of his kids who was having school problems, his mother gave him these beans that their family had brought to that part of North Carolina 150 years ago. And he said he feels really bad because he didn't really get that family's story, and then of course he left that part of North Carolina, but he took their beans with him. And it lets you kind of know that even when someone's been keeping things a long time, it's a bit ephemeral. And so if you find something that you like, that you think is delicious and worthwhile, that maybe it's time for you to adopt it, because maybe the people who carried it that far are not going to be the ones going forward. It's going to be you. Stories They just take you back, and they help you rewrite the history so that people who were written out come back in. Michael Twitty, in his Cooking Gene, sort of traces back history of black people in the U.S. looking at the foods that they were eating at different times, and in a way pointing out that what became the Southern cuisine couldn't have happened without food influences from Africa, from the Native American people coming together with European cooking and making something distinct. There's a small amount of people who are independent who are growing seeds, and there are less people who are having big home gardens, so less of them who are saving seeds. So that's one of the reasons we do a lot of seed saving workshops, put a lot of information available, on the internet, work with other groups to try to do the same thing, because we feel that just like growing some of your own food is one way to reduce your carbon footprint and have a little bit more independence, that seed saving is like that. And it doesn't take saving everything, because, with all these family heirlooms, most of those families only save, 1 to 3 different varieties, and they buy the rest of their seeds. But if you're in communities and there are, 10 people saving this and 10 there, if things get difficult, like what happened like in the Second World War, and seeds are not so available, those people can share with each other and with other people in their communities. There's banking things and keeping them frozen in case of emergencies. But climate is changing. The world, even gardening techniques, things that are more technical, are changing. So a company that is both growing every few years those varieties out is also keeping up with the changes and the reactions of the variety to the environment. Whereas in Svalbard, I doubt that anything there is going to be regenerated more than once every 50 years or 25 years. They say when we look at these heirlooms, these farmers who developed these heirlooms were looking for the best in their garden every year. So there are things that we're trying to keep similar, but disease resistance and yield and stuff like that, we're working to keep those up. And I'm not sure that work would happen if you didn't have an in situ type situation.